So, as of August of 2026, the war in Ukraine is still going on, and it really doesn't look like it's going to end within the next couple of months at least. And this war has led to hundreds of thousands of dead combined with both sides, and who knows how many wounded. And we won't know until this war has ended, because releasing those reports of your dead and wounded is incredibly important information. And you really don't want to give that out to either side. But it is safe to say that this has led to an insane amount of bloodshed. And just like every other war, it will continue until the war is over. But unlike a lot of other wars, this war has two centralized militaries that are recording and televising everything. You have World War One, where you start seeing photographs come out, except the photographs take a long time to reach the US. And then you have World War II, where you have videos of the war. But by the time the videos make it back home, the event has already happened, and it happened a while ago. Because for operational security reasons, you don't want that being released. Well, in this war, you have videos from body cams being posted on social media sites and online all the time. It is currently 1 in the morning here, and it is going to be middle of the day over there. Some place in Ukraine right now is doing something that will be posted somewhere on the internet. I can almost guarantee it. And it has led to seeing the tactics and inventions of this war in good quality and on multiple angles, which is really fascinating to watch. But it is also showing the absolute worst of the war to everybody. And it is scary to see not just the new tactics and inventions, but some of the older tactics that have been brought back because we've come full circle and looped back in on ourselves. One of the things that we've looped back in on is trench warfare to an extended degree. It is impossibly scary. In today's episode, we're looking at, have we looped back to the Great War? And to that, I would say, kind of. Yes and no. Not Great War in the sense of 4 years of sitting in the same positions, but Great War as in some of the tactics have been brought back, but still changed. And we'll get into that. So, hope you enjoy it. This might be a little bit longer episode than usual. So, today's episode is mainly going to be about trenches. And this photograph here is of a handful of French soldiers making their way through the trenches near Verdun in 1916. And we are going to study this a little bit before we move on to the Ukraine photos, because a lot of the focus will be on trenches, and it's important that you have a good solid footing of World War I trenches before we move on. Now, you can see that these World War I trenches were made very hastily. They are just dirt built into the ground, and you can see that there's a lot of remnants. There's still smoke going on. So a lot of World War I trenches built during warfare, like active warfare, or built relatively new, were not maintained to the best degree. And Ukraine has those types of trenches, and you'll see in a minute. But you're already looking at a Ukraine trench photo, because this photo is from Ukraine. And this is the original. Now, here's the original photograph. And I took this photograph from a recording of an FPV drone that was going over a battle in Ukraine. And I took it into a grayscale editor and I decreased the pixel count. This is a reality for a fair chunk of the Ukrainian and Russian armies right now fighting in Ukraine that have been sitting in trenches for years now. The warfare in Ukraine is scary similar in some aspects to World War I. You had this big series of movements during the first year of the war, where the Russians took a handful of cities, and they made this massive assault on an airport, and they had this huge convoy of tanks and trucks. And then after a handful of months, the line kind of stabilized and they dug in a little bit. And then you start seeing videos a year into the war, 2 years into the war, of them living in trenches. And now there's videos of them in these trenches that have TVs in them. And they've been there for a while. It is eerily similar to World War I, but it's not the same at all. The only thing that has kind of really stayed the same is portions of how the trench was designed. That's it. And this trench that you see here was very hastily made. It looks like it was made relatively quickly, and they have not been using it for a while based off of the condition of the trench. It's really just, a trench dug in the ground. There's no shoring on the walls. OSHA would be going insane. It's branching off in a bunch of different directions. But you can see that it looks to be a tunnel on the left-hand side. Kind of looks like there might be a tunnel on the northern part of the image. And it's definitely active. And there are other trenches that have been made up a lot better than this, and we'll look at those next. So this image here is a screenshot from an aerial view that I found from 3 years ago in April of 2023. And this is a Ukrainian position that is showing the fluidity of the war and how the fluidity of the war has changed the trenches. In World War I, you have lines and lines of trenches, and they are all connected by communication trenches, and they are a mile, 2 miles deep. They're huge. But in Ukraine, the situation is fluid enough that the trenches are no longer connected to each other via communication trenches. You have singular lines of infantry trenches, and then a handful of miles back, you have a second line, and then a handful of miles back, you have a third line. It is crazy. And these lines have incorporated new tech with old tactics to make even more, just diabolically horrible trenches. On this image, you have the primary defensive trench on the bottom. That's where the infantry is. It's still jagged, just like World War I. That way, if somebody gets in the trench, they can't shoot straight down. And there's dugouts, there's bunkers, there is, camouflage netting on it. It is just like a World War I trench. And then a couple 100 feet ahead of the trench is your Devil's Teeth defensive obstacles, which are concrete blocks, and also in that are going to be barbed wire and concertina wire, just like World War I, where you would place your barbed wire a couple 100 feet ahead of the trench. That way, you would have enough time to shoot your enemy before they were right on top of you. Sometimes in World War I, that barbed wire would be 50 feet ahead, but it seems to be that they have standardized the way they make their trenches in Ukraine to fit a very specific objective. And it also is reflected in this image here as well. Because beyond the Devil's Teeth is the third line, and that is the anti-tank ditch. This is where new tech is combining with old tactics. And it's not necessarily a new tech in the sense of this is the first time anti-tank ditches have been used. Anti-tank ditches were used widely in World War II. But in World War I, anti-tank ditches were not used because the area in no man's land was so heavily guarded that it was impossible to dig an anti-tank ditch without the enemy knowing. But in Ukraine, where the situation is fluid and they're making these lines miles away from the front, and they have the technology with bulldozers to make an anti-tank ditch, it has become standard practice to make an anti-tank ditch on both sides. It is absolutely mind-boggling seeing the ways that they have come up with defending from new tech, but also incorporating older trenches. Now, this image on the screen here is a satellite image that I managed to screenshot when I was looking around in Ukraine. And it shows a Russian trench line near the southern-ish part of Ukraine. And you can see that you have the anti-tank ditch, you have this thin gray line, which I imagine to be Devil's Teeth / concertina wire, and then you have your infantry line. Again, it's just the singular line because it's too fluid for them to have multiple lines and that be, the equivalent of economically viable. And you can see on this infantry line, you have all the little, dugouts next to it, and, all of the dugouts you can't see, and the living quarters. It is just like a World War I trench, but it is accommodating for the new tech that has caused them to, one, go back into trenches, and two, adapting to the fluidity of a newer war. And it is absolutely insane to see in real time. And this is not just a one-off thing either. If you go into this satellite browser that I found online, you can see across the entire front trenches that look just like this, and trenches that look slightly different. There are some places near big cities where the fighting is the heaviest that they have made trenches that are in a full circle, like a 360-degree circle, because they never know which direction the enemy might be coming from, because they could be overran at any moment. And it shows that there is something that is causing them to have to make a trench. Because if you don't have to make a trench, you wouldn't make a trench. But trenches have become so incredibly important that even in the heaviest fighting, where they could be any direction around you, there are the accommodations for that. And we'll cover that as well in a minute. Now, here is the full image, and you can see in the bottom right where I took that photo from. This is as far zoomed out as I could get, where you could still see the trenches. What is not shown is a third line south of the two lines that you see here. The other one is on the north side. I'll show arrows on the screen. And these trenches reflect the fluidity that I'm talking about at the highest degree. It is actually just the most fascinating thing to look at. And I have so many questions that I would absolutely give my arm for to have answered by somebody that's actually there and doing this. And one of them involves, why are the trenches so spread out? And I have a couple theories as to why, but nothing concrete. And one of them revolves around when you had these series of trenches that were all connected in World War I, you were a big stationary target. If you are a army today and you have planes that have payloads that can drop tons and tons of bombs on you, or coordinated missile strikes, and all the lines are compressed together like a World War I trench, you are a massive target. But by presenting yourself as single lines of infantry, and you separate those lines by 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, you have now made it to the point where it doesn't make sense to have missiles or planes attack each individual line. You have now proofed yourself from those attacks. And also by having these lines separated that far, with the fluidity of the war and how it's going, it almost makes more sense to have it set up this way. Because even if they take that first line, they then have to cross another couple miles of open fields before they get to the second line. And then a couple miles of open fields before they get to the third line, where the city and the airport that the Russians are defending is. It is really well thought out, and the Ukrainians have setups like this too that are also incredibly well thought out, and it reflects not just the fluidity but the tech that has evolved and has changed the trench warfare that we know of from World War I. It is incredible that they have advanced to this level this quickly. The last time that we saw trench warfare on this scale was the Iran-Iraq War of 1980. And even then, that war did not have trenches to this level, and they were not nearly as sophisticated as the ones that you see here are. And the other thing is that these trenches are incomprehensibly massive. In World War I, the longest trench that you would see was 3 miles. And that was huge. 3-mile continuous trench. There are trenches that are on satellite image. I have seen trenches that would make that 3-mile trench look like it has been dwarfed. And I couldn't tell you how accurate it is. I saw it on a news article. It's not very accurate right now, but it was talking about a 40-mile long trench. If that is true, if there legitimately is a 40-mile long trench somewhere in Ukraine, we are seeing the biggest trench warfare on the history of the planet. And it isn't incomprehensible to think about either. It's not impossible. They have the technology to make these trenches that big. Instead of having 40 guys with shovels digging away under fire, if you set up a line 2 or 3 miles back and you have a bulldozer and you give that bulldozer one afternoon, it will clear out a trench that is big enough that a full platoon of people can be in it. And if you get multiple bulldozers and you have all the people, you can make a trench that theoretically could be as long as you want it to be. Because they have the tech to do so. And I really wouldn't be surprised if by the end of this war, we see a trench that is tens of miles long. And I can't wait to see what comes out of that. Now, we've covered the setup of the trenches and how they have changed. And you can see that the changes to the trenches have changed drastically since World War I. But what's actually inside of the trench on a person-to-person level makes it look a whole lot more like World War I. And we're going to cover that now. So this image is a screenshot that I pulled off of a Ukrainian regiment fighting in Ukraine. And they are repulsing a Russian attack. And it is one of the scariest photos I have seen, especially recently. Because these soldiers are sitting in a trench. And not only are they sitting in a trench, this used to be a forest, and it goes back as far as you can see. And that hasn't changed either. In World War I, trenches were made in forest because they offered the best amount of protection. And then once the trench is found, shelling reduces that forest down to what you see here, where it's just ruined tree stumps. But then what's scarier about this is that somewhere in that photograph is a Russian trench. And inside of that Russian trench are Russian soldiers that have also been in that trench for months. And even scarier than that is if this Ukrainian soldier doesn't stand up over this trench and the Russian soldiers don't stand up over that trench and nobody tries to attack each other, they can live hundreds of feet across from each other and never see each other. They can go forever hearing each other but not seeing each other. And that is terrifying. And that is just like what it was in World War I. And I am sure that there are Russian photographs of Russian soldiers taking photos of their no man's land. And you can't see the Ukrainian trench, but it's definitely there somewhere. Now, this image here is one of the most important photos of a trench I think I've seen, because it shows not just the construction of the trench, but it shows it in a high quality and it shows it in color. And not just that, it shows a trench from an opposing force. These are Ukrainians storming a Russian trench. And you can see that it has been built up extremely well. They were planning on staying here for a good while. And it seems to be that they did stay there for a good while based off of what's happening in the background. But like a World War I trench, it's been reinforced with the walls to stop it from caving in. The only thing that's changed is the technology that they used to build up the trench. You can see that they added in metal grates and they have sheets to protect the dirt from coming in. This trench is going to be able to withstand most anything that gets thrown at it as long as it doesn't land in the trench, because they have that tech now. They have a roof over it that's been made out of fine wooden planks with camouflage netting to protect from reconnaissance and FPV drones. In World War I, you would have the walls reinforced by wooden sticks. You would have them reinforced by planks if you got fancy with it. Concrete if you're really fancy with it. And yet, it doesn't compare to what we can do today because the tech has caught up. We have gotten to that point. And in World War I, you have camouflage netting because you had to protect yourself from reconnaissance planes. And now we have camouflage netting as well. That hasn't changed much, but the reconnaissance that we're hiding from has changed. And it's now more important to stay hidden. And it is absolutely insane watching old tactics and new tech mold together. Now, also in this photograph, you can see that it goes back. That is a dugout. That is a tunnel. Who knows what that could be? But it is crazy that not only is this trench there, there are hundreds of trenches that look just like this in so many different places. Now, here's a photo that might look a little bit more like World War I, and this is a Ukrainian soldier standing in ankle-deep mud. And as far as I can tell, in Ukraine, the mud like this in a trench is a rarity, not a commonplace thing. It seems to be that this happened after winter, like winter going into spring, because they do get snow. Once the snow melts, you do get this kind of mud. Or it could be happening in the spring when they get a lot of rain. Now, again, rarity. You can see that this trench was made very hastily. They do have a dugout on the far side, but they have no shoring on the walls. It looks like it's very dirty. Seems like they've been there for a little bit, but not a crazy amount of time. And I am very fascinated to see, have there been any cases of trench foot? And we're not going to know that until well after the war is ended. But I would imagine no, because the technology that we use to treat soldiers medical-wise and the medical knowledge should be advanced enough that we shouldn't have any trench foot issues. But we are also using old tactics, so maybe there is trench foot. But again, nobody's gonna know until this war is over. But scenes like this, again, a rarity, not commonplace, but it's also not a super rare sight either. It's a fine balance, but it's not every trench over there is just a mudden, pool that everybody gets trench foot in. Now, you know how the trenches are set up, and I can make an entire video just going off of all the different types of trenches they have in Ukraine. I mean, they have trenches in circles, they have trenches for artillery, they have trenches in lines, they have trenches in multiple lines in some places. I saw one that was 2 lines parallel to each other. That was a lot more like World War I. There are so many different things that have yet to be uncovered about this war that won't be uncovered for a good while. But as these satellites continuously update the satellite view and people keep sleuthing around on there, we will see more and more things. Now, what I am also excited to see is the Russians have slowly been claiming land from Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Ukraine has continuously been losing land, but the rate that they are losing land is less than the rate that Russia is gaining casualties. And at this rate, Russia will be bled white before they can get Ukraine and make them, forced surrender. Now, I do think that Ukraine will win this. Ukraine did, for the first time back in March, gain a net positive of land from Russia. And with more support from other nations, I do think that they have a good chance. Russia is now relying more and more on North Korean soldiers, which are known to be underfed, undertrained, and have no clue what's going on. And you have a language barrier, which shows that Russia is slowly losing its manpower, which isn't a secret either, and their economy is going down. And as Ukraine takes more and more land back from the Russians, and these fortifications come back into Ukrainian hands, and we start to see what was going on, and Ukrainians take back their positions and what they had going on, I really do think that we are going to see some revolutionary designs in trench warfare extremely soon. And by extremely soon, I mean like a year or two, but relatively pretty soon. Now, why have we gone back to trench warfare? Because you have World War II, where you don't have a whole lot of trench warfare. You have Vietnam, there's not a lot of trench warfare there. And you have the Gulf Wars, the wars in the Middle East, and they don't have trench warfare. So why did we end up in trench warfare here? And that's due to a handful of reasons. And the big one is artillery and this guy. This is the single scariest invention of war that I have seen, because it is so simple, but so incredibly effective. This is an FPV drone. They cost like $20 to make, and they require almost no training. The shell that is on the bottom of this drone, I am willing to bet costs more than the drone itself. These drones are piloted by any age. You can put a person that is 60 and can't walk and is now a soldier because they can fly one of these. And they can fly tens of miles away from the user. Go find a singular target, whether that's a truck or an individual person, and with an extraordinarily high success rate, strike their target. And from the other POV, you are going about your day, and in the faint distance, you just hear this tiny little whirring noise, and then it gets louder. And then this thing streaks past you at 30 miles an hour, which isn't an overstatement, because some of these drones hit 50 miles an hour. Because they're that fast, they're that lightweight, and that is a terrifying thought. And what makes it scarier is that there's almost no things to combat this yet, which is why we've gone back to trench warfare. In World War I, you have machine guns which pin people down, and then once they're pinned down, the artillery comes in, and once the artillery comes in, if you're not below ground, you're going to get blown up, you're going to get hit by shrapnel. Well, in this war, you have machine guns and you have tanks, which are pinning people down. And then you have these guys, plus artillery, which are flying around. And if you are not hidden or below ground, the shrapnel will hit you, which is part of the reason why we've gone back to trench warfare. And until we get a solid way of taking down these little drones, they will stay in trench warfare. And there are ways that they are combating these in the meantime, but they aren't effective enough. One of them is to take a shotgun with buckshot or birdshot or any of those little pellets and then shoot at the drone and hope one of those hits, because it doesn't take much to take them down. That's the one good thing. It doesn't take much. But the odds of hitting one of these going 30 miles an hour is extremely slim. The other one is they just wait, they hide, and they hope it doesn't hit them. And then you have some crazier ones, like a plane flying side by side with a drone, and then a guy in the backseat of the plane shooting at it with a rifle or a shotgun. Or there are hawks that have been trained to hit these out of the sky. They have tied 8 AK-47s together and put them on a stand and have tried to shoot them down with 8 AKs at a time, making their own shotgun. Anything until the new invention comes around that will combat this. Because just like machine guns, just like tanks, just like any invention out there, until there is something to combat it, there is nothing that will stop it. Until there is a combat for this piece of tech will win. Once we have a combat for this piece of tech, the other piece of tech becomes useless. And then a new piece of tech arises, and the cycle keeps going on and on and on and on. And the piece of tech that could combat this is going to be this weird box, basically. It doesn't even fire a bullet. It fires out these little rays that will fry the electrical system of these drones. And it can supposedly drop up to 60 drones at the same time. But how long until that reaches the front line? And nobody knows. Now, who knows if this tech, when it comes out, it could be very soon. And I have seen individual units being given out, but until this is widespread, will it work? Even if it is widespread, will that work? How fast after these become widespread will there be a combat to those rays? What if somebody comes out and says, well, I figured out this shielding that blocks those rays, and now we're back to square one because these things can just blow through the rays. And that is the very realistic cycle for literally every piece of technology. It will never end. It never has ended. And it is terrifying. Now, until you are moving very fluidly, you have to defend, right? If you are staying in a spot, you are on the defense. And until you go and attack, you're staying on defense. The best way to defend is with a trench. It always has been, always will be. Now, why is defending with a trench so good? It is so incredibly important to defend with a trench because it takes away the attacker's advantages. It strips all of them away. And the only thing that the attacker has left is going to be ranged attacks, hoping that they can soften you up enough where an assault becomes a viable option. Ukraine has been numerically outnumbered by Russia since day one. Okay? And let's say they have 10 guys and Russia has 20 guys. If 10 Russian soldiers shoot at the Ukrainian soldiers, they can pin them down. And if the Ukrainians are stuck there and they can't move, because if they move, these guys will shoot them, Russia can just send 4 guys on this side and 4 guys on this side to surround the Ukrainians, and that's it. They can't defend anymore because they can only hold out for so long. Numerically superior enemies will always win unless you have some absolutely insane way of defending. What is that absolutely insane way of defending? It's a trench. Because with the invention of a trench, even if the Russians have 20 guys and you only have 10 guys, you have eliminated the possibility of the Russians attacking from 180 degrees. You have taken away their freedom of movement and their ability to surround you. So now 20 Russians hop out of the trench and they start running across no man's land. If this guy with an automatic rifle can take out 4 Russians running across a completely open field, this guy doesn't have to take out any. And if this guy takes out 2 and this guy takes out 2 and this guy takes out 4, this guy doesn't have to take out any because the average just has to become 20. And that's it. You've taken out everything that the advancing army has on you. And that is why trenches will always be just the most beautiful way of a defender's method, because it works so flawlessly. Now, the methods of how they build the trenches will always change, as you've seen in World War I to present day. That's always going to change. But it doesn't matter, because if you can take away the freedom of movement from your enemy that is numerically superior to you, you've done it great. Now, the combat to a trench is going to be artillery, it's going to be these FPV drones, it's going to be airstrikes, but realistically, there's not much the Russians can do to combat a trench like this. The Ukrainians realistically can't do much to combat a trench like this. They don't have enough FPV drones to make trenches go away. Neither of them has an air force to airstrike the trenches enough. Neither of them have the correct amount of people or supplies to directly attack a trench head on any front with a 100% success rate, which is why we've seen trench warfare show up so heavily, and it will stay that way. But again, it's fluid enough that they are making trenches miles and miles apart. So it is this really, really weird situation that we are seeing develop, and it is absolutely mind-blowing to see happen in real time. And I see this war ending in one of two ways. The first one is they figure out how to combat the drones, and now they are free to move about as they feel like, and trench warfare no longer becomes a thing that's widely used, because while there's artillery, there's not enough artillery on either side. Or they never combat the drones, and then the trench warfare goes on and on and on and on and on until somebody makes some major breakthrough. The strikes in Russia happen to intensify and Russia gives in. Russia's economy collapses. Russia doesn't have enough manpower. Or the same thing going back on the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't have enough manpower. The Ukrainians' economy collapses. But until these drones are taken out and the artillery completely goes away, we're stuck with trench warfare for a good while. And I really wouldn't be surprised if this war becomes a very defining moment for warfare for decades from now. This is the first time in decades that we have seen a centralized military force fight another centralized military force. And you have two central militaries with modern day equipment fighting each other on roughly equal terms. And this will be studied to absolutely insane levels. And it's going to be fascinating to see. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I might make another one about Ukraine because there's just so much stuff to talk about happening over there right now. Hope you enjoyed. Hope I'll see you guys in the next one.